The conference room at Blackwater Defense Solutions fell silent except for the muffled snickering coming from the corner where three senior executives sat reviewing resumes. Margaret Chen adjusted her dress uniform one final time before stepping through the glass doors, her polished boots clicking against the marble floor with precision that only came from 15 years of military discipline. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. What they didn't know was that in exactly 72 hours, those same men would be watching CNN in stunned silence as the Secretary of Defense announced Margaret's promotion to Brigadier General, the youngest woman in the U.S. Army history to achieve that rank. But that moment was still 3 days away, and right now, Margaret had to endure the most humiliating job interview of her life. Margaret had walked into Blackwater Defense Solutions that Tuesday morning carrying more than just her resume. She carried the weight of a distinguished military career that had taken her from a small farm in Nebraska to the front lines of 3 different conflicts. Her service record read like something out of a military thriller: counterterrorism operations in Afghanistan, intelligence work in Eastern Europe, and leadership roles that had earned her commendations from generals whose names appeared in history books. But to the executives sitting across from her in their expensive suits, she was just another soldier trying to make it in the civilian world. The interview had started professionally enough. Margaret presented her qualifications with the same confidence she'd used when briefing 4-star generals. She outlined her experience managing complex operations, leading teams under extreme pressure, and making split-second decisions that had saved countless lives. Her record spoke for itself: 15 years of exceptional service, multiple deployments, and a track record of success that would make any organization proud to have her. Then the questions began to shift. "Miss Chen," said Morrison, deliberately mispronouncing her rank, "we appreciate your military background. But this is the private sector. We need people who understand profit margins, not parade formations." The comment drew knowing looks between the executives. Margaret maintained her composure, explaining how her experience in resource management and strategic planning directly translated to business operations. She described how she'd managed multi-million-dollar budgets, coordinated with international partners, and delivered results under impossible deadlines. "That's all very impressive," interrupted Sandra Whitfield, the company's vice president of human resources, "but we're looking for someone with real leadership experience. Someone who's worked with actual professionals. Not just, enlisted personnel." The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Margaret felt her jaw tighten, but she kept her voice steady. "Ma'am, I've had the honor of serving alongside some of the most dedicated and skilled professionals in the world. The men and women I've led have demonstrated courage, expertise, and commitment that—" "Oh, please," Morrison cut her off with a dismissive wave. "We all know military leadership is just about barking orders and following a manual. This company needs innovative thinking, not someone who's been programmed to follow instructions without question." Margaret's hands remained folded in her lap, but her knuckles had gone white. She'd faced enemy fire with less stress than she felt, sitting in this sterile conference room watching her service being mocked by people who'd never worn a uniform, never made a decision where lives hung in the balance, never stood between their country and those who wished it harm. "Let me ask you this," continued Whitfield, leaning back in her leather chair with a smirk. "What's your biggest accomplishment? And please don't tell us about some medal ceremony or military exercise. We need real-world achievements." Margaret took a measured breath. She could have told them about the classified operation in Kabul, where her quick thinking had prevented a terrorist attack that would have killed hundreds of civilians. She could have described the diplomatic crisis she'd helped resolve in Prague, or the training program she'd developed that had become standard across 3 different military branches. Instead, she chose a more modest example. "I developed and implemented a logistics system that reduced supply chain inefficiencies by 37% across 4 forward operating bases. This resulted in faster delivery of critical supplies and saved the Department of Defense approximately $8 million annually." Morrison exchanged glances with his colleagues before responding. "Supply chain management, really? Our warehouse supervisor could probably tell you the same thing. We were hoping for something more, Substantial. The third executive, David Hartwell, who'd been silent throughout most of the interview, finally spoke up. Look, Miss Chen, we're sure you're a fine person. But military service is essentially government work, and we all know how efficient government employees are. His comment was followed by another round of chuckles. The discipline and structure of military life might actually be a disadvantage here, added Whitfield. We need creative problem solvers, not people who wait for orders from above. Can you even make decisions without checking a regulation manual first? Margaret felt something burning in her chest, not anger, but a profound sadness for these people who understood so little about what service really meant. They saw uniforms and thought of rigid conformity. They heard about military experience and imagined mindless obedience. They had no concept of the innovation, creativity, and independent thinking required to succeed in modern warfare. I understand your concerns, Margaret replied evenly. However, I believe you may have some misconceptions about military service. In my experience, successful military leaders must be extremely adaptable, innovative, and capable of making critical decisions with incomplete information. The challenges we face require misconceptions? Morrison interrupted, his tone growing more condescending. Miss Chen, with all due respect, we've worked with military contractors before. We know exactly what to expect. You're trained to follow a chain of command, not to think outside the box. That's not what we need here. Hartwell nodded in agreement. Plus, there's the whole team dynamic to consider. Our employees are professionals who've chosen their careers based on merit and ambition, not because they needed job security or couldn't figure out what else to do with their lives. The implication hit Margaret like a physical blow. These people genuinely believed that military service was a fallback option for people who couldn't succeed in the real world. They saw her 15 years of dedicated service as evidence of her limitations, not her strengths. I'm curious, said Whitfield, her voice dripping with false concern. What exactly made you choose the military? Was it financial necessity, or did you just need more structure in your life? Margaret thought about her father, a veteran of Vietnam, who'd taught her about duty, honor, and sacrifice. She thought about her first commanding officer, a brilliant strategist who'd shown her that true leadership meant serving others. She thought about the young soldiers she'd mentored, many of whom had gone on to successful careers both in and out of the military. I chose to serve because I believe in something greater than myself, she answered simply. The executives exchanged looks that clearly communicated their thoughts, idealistic and naive. That's very noble, Morrison said in a tone that suggested it was anything but. But nobility doesn't increase market share or improve quarterly earnings. We need someone who understands that the bottom line is what matters, not abstract concepts like duty and honor. Margaret realized that this interview had stopped being about the job long ago. These people had made up their minds before she'd even walked through the door. They'd brought her in not because they were genuinely considering hiring her, but because they needed to fill some quota or check a box for veteran outreach. Tell me, continued Hartwell, if you were in charge of a project and your team disagreed with your approach, what would you do? In the military, I assume you just order them to comply, but that doesn't work in the corporate world. Actually, Margaret responded, her patience wearing thin but her professionalism intact, effective military leadership requires constant collaboration, input from subject matter experts, and the ability to adapt strategies based on changing conditions and team feedback. The best military leaders I've known were excellent listeners who valued diverse perspectives. That sounds nice in theory, said Whitfield, but we've all heard the stories about military culture. It's all about hierarchy and control, not the kind of collaborative environment we've built here. Margaret looked around the room at these three executives who clearly believed they represented the pinnacle of professional achievement. She wondered if they'd ever had to make a decision, knowing that the wrong choice could cost someone their life. She wondered if they'd ever worked 18-hour days not for a bonus or promotion, but because failure wasn't an option when people were counting on them. Morrison glanced at his expensive watch and sighed dramatically. Well, Miss Chen, we appreciate you taking the time to meet with us. We'll be in touch if anything opens up that might be a better fit for your skill set. The dismissal was clear, but Margaret had one more question of her own. May I ask what specific qualifications you're looking for in the ideal candidate? Someone with real leadership experience, Morrison answered without hesitation. Someone who's built teams, managed complex projects, and delivered results in a competitive environment. Someone who understands what it takes to succeed in the modern business world. Margaret nodded slowly, gathering her materials. She'd built teams that had operated in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. She'd managed projects where failure meant international incidents. She'd delivered results when the stakes couldn't have been higher. But apparently, none of that counted as real experience. As she stood to leave, Hartwell added one final comment. "Don't take this personally, Miss Chen. It's just that military service is very different from what we do here. You're used to having everything planned out for you, following protocols, working within established systems. Our business moves fast, requires quick thinking, and demands the kind of flexibility that military training just doesn't provide." Margaret paused at the door, her hand on the handle. For just a moment, she considered telling them about the time she'd improvised a complete mission overhaul in the middle of a firefight, saving her entire unit. She thought about mentioning the innovative training techniques she'd developed that were now being used throughout the armed forces. She almost described the diplomatic negotiations she'd conducted that had prevented an international crisis. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Instead, she simply said, "Thank you for your time," and walked out. As the conference room door closed behind her, Margaret could hear the renewed chuckling and comments from the executives. She caught fragments of their conversation as she walked down the hallway. Another one who thinks military service makes them special probably expects us to thank her for her service. These veterans need to understand that the real world doesn't owe them anything. Margaret maintained her composure until she reached her car in the parking garage. Only then did she allow herself a moment to process what had just happened. She'd been prepared for tough questions, challenging scenarios, even skepticism about how her military experience would translate to the private sector. But she hadn't been prepared for the complete dismissal of her service, the mocking attitude, or the fundamental misunderstanding of what military leadership actually required. She sat in her car for several minutes, watching the bustling city around her. Civilians hurried past, focused on their own lives and concerns, blissfully unaware of the sacrifices made by people like her to ensure their freedom and security. She didn't expect gratitude, but she also didn't expect such casual contempt. Margaret's phone buzzed with a text message from her former commanding officer. "Remember, Chen, the best leaders are often underestimated. That's what makes their eventual success so satisfying." She smiled despite herself. Colonel Patricia Williams had been a mentor throughout Margaret's career, and her timing was impeccable as always. Margaret started her car and drove home, unaware that in exactly 67 hours her life was about to change in ways that would make this humiliating interview seem like a distant, insignificant memory. But first, she had to endure 2 more days of doubt, rejection, and the nagging question of whether her 15 years of service had prepared her for anything other than more service. The answer to that question would come in a way that none of those executives could possibly imagine. Margaret returned to her modest apartment in Arlington, Virginia, her mind still processing the events at Blackwater Defense Solutions. The familiar surroundings offered little comfort. Her living room walls, adorned with commendations and photographs from her various deployments, seemed to mock her recent experience. Had she really been naive to think her military accomplishments would matter in the civilian world? Her laptop chimed with an email notification. 3 more rejection letters had arrived while she was at the interview. Tech Core Industries. While we admire your service, we're seeking candidates with more relevant industry experience. Meridian Financial Group. Your background is impressive, but we need someone who understands our fast-paced corporate culture. Global Dynamics Corporation. Thank you for your interest, but we've decided to move forward with other candidates. The pattern was becoming depressingly familiar. Each rejection carried the same underlying message. Military service was somehow less valuable than civilian experience, regardless of the complexity or responsibility involved. Margaret poured herself a cup of coffee, and opened her laptop to continue the job search that had been consuming her life for the past 3 months. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. The caller ID showed Colonel Williams, her former commanding officer and mentor. "Chen, how did the interview go today?" Margaret hesitated. Patricia Williams had been instrumental in her career development, providing guidance and support through some of the most challenging assignments of her military service. The colonel had connections throughout both the military and civilian sectors, and Margaret didn't want to sound ungrateful for the introduction to Blackwater. "It was educational," Margaret replied diplomatically. "That bad, huh?" Williams chuckled. "Look, Margaret, I know the transition can be tough, but don't let a few ignorant civilians define your worth. You're one of the finest officers I've ever had the privilege to serve with." "I appreciate that, Colonel, but sometimes I wonder if I made the right decision leaving the service. Maybe I should have stayed in, worked toward full retirement." "Are you having second thoughts about your resignation?" Margaret stared out her apartment window at the bustling street below. She'd submitted her resignation 6 months ago, convinced that 15 years of service had prepared her for success in the civilian world. The decision hadn't been made lightly. She'd spent months considering her options, weighing the benefits of continued military service against the opportunity to apply her skills in the private sector. "Sometimes," she admitted, "today's interview made me realize how little civilians understand about what we actually do. They see military service as some kind of limitation rather than an asset." "Their loss," Williams said firmly. "Any organization that can't recognize your value doesn't deserve you. But Margaret, there's something I need to tell you. Something confidential that I probably shouldn't be sharing, but I think you need to hear it." Margaret straightened in her chair. Colonel Williams was not prone to dramatic statements or breaking protocol. "What is it, Colonel?" "I can't give you details, but, well, let's just say that your resignation letter hasn't been processed yet. There may be some developments that change your perspective on things." "I don't understand. What kind of developments?" "I can't say more right now. Just don't make any hasty decisions about your future. And Margaret, keep Thursday evening free. Trust me on this one." Before Margaret could ask for clarification, the line went dead. She stared at her phone, trying to decode Williams' cryptic message. What could possibly happen on Thursday that would affect her resignation? And why hadn't her paperwork been processed after 6 months? The rest of Tuesday evening passed in a blur of job applications and increasingly frustrated phone calls. Margaret contacted her former colleagues who had successfully transitioned to civilian careers, hoping for advice or leads. The conversations were revealing in ways she hadn't expected. Captain Michael Rodriguez, who had left the Army 2 years earlier and now worked for a consulting firm in Chicago, was brutally honest about his experience. "Margaret, I'm not going to sugarcoat this. The first year was hell. I had hiring managers tell me to my face that military officers are too rigid for their corporate culture. One guy actually asked if I knew how to think for myself or if I just followed orders all day. How did you get through it?" "Persistence and luck, mostly. I finally found a company where the CEO was a veteran. He understood what our experience actually means. But I had to take a significant pay cut and basically start over at entry level, despite having led operations that these corporate types couldn't imagine." Similar conversations with other former colleagues revealed a disturbing pattern. Major Sarah Thompson, now working in logistics for a Fortune 500 company, described being passed over for promotions because managers assumed she couldn't adapt to, quote, civilian thinking. Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison, who had become a project manager at an engineering firm, shared stories of colleagues who openly questioned whether military experience had any relevance to real work. "The thing that bothers me most," Harrison explained, "is the assumption that we're somehow damaged or limited by our service. They act like military training erases your ability to be creative or innovative, when the opposite is true. Some of the most creative problem-solving I've ever seen happened in the field when standard procedures weren't enough." Margaret spent Wednesday morning at another interview, this time with Paramount Industries. The meeting followed a depressingly familiar script. The hiring manager, a thin man named Gregory Peterson, spent most of the interview explaining why military experience wasn't relevant to their needs. "Ms. Chen, I'm sure you're very disciplined and organized," Peterson said with the same condescending tone she'd heard at Blackwater. "But our industry requires adaptability and innovation. Military personnel tend to be very structured in their thinking." "Can you give me an example of the kind of innovation you're looking for?" Margaret asked, genuinely curious about what these civilian managers considered creative thinking. Peterson launched into a detailed description of a project where his team had reduced processing time by implementing a new software system. The solution was elegant and effective, but Margaret couldn't help noticing that it was essentially the same type of process improvement she'd implemented multiple times during her military career, just in a different context. "That's an excellent solution," she said diplomatically. "I actually implemented something similar when I was stationed in Germany. We had a logistics bottleneck that was delaying critical supplies to forward positions. By analyzing the data flow and redesigning the authorization process, we reduced delivery times by 43%. Peterson looked skeptical. "But that was just following military procedures, right? What we do here requires real creativity, thinking outside established protocols." Margaret realized that no amount of explanation would convince Peterson that her military experience involved genuine innovation. In his mind, anything done within a military context was automatically less creative, less valuable, less real than civilian work. The interview ended with another polite rejection, and Margaret found herself walking through downtown D.C., trying to clear her head. She passed groups of tourists visiting the various monuments and memorials, many of them taking selfies in front of tributes to military service. The irony wasn't lost on her. Society claimed to honor veterans, but the business world seemed determined to prove that their service was irrelevant. Her phone buzzed with a text from her younger brother, David, who worked as a software engineer in Silicon Valley. "Hey sis, how's the job hunt going? Dad's been asking if you need help with anything." Margaret smiled despite her frustration. Her family had been incredibly supportive throughout her career, even when deployments kept her away for months at a time. Her father, a retired police officer, understood the challenges of transitioning from service to civilian life, though his experience had been decades earlier when veterans faced different obstacles. She typed back, "Still searching. Apparently 15 years of leadership experience doesn't count if it happened in uniform." David's response came immediately. "Their loss. Any company that doesn't see your value is too stupid to succeed anyway." Margaret appreciated the support, but she was beginning to wonder if there was something fundamentally wrong with her approach. Maybe she needed to downplay her military experience, focus more on the technical skills and quantifiable achievements. Maybe she should consider going back to school, getting an MBA or some other credential that would validate her worth in civilian eyes. Wednesday evening brought another round of rejection emails and automated responses from companies that weren't even bothering to schedule interviews. Margaret found herself questioning decisions she'd made years earlier. Should she have pursued a different specialization during her military career? Should she have started networking in the civilian world sooner? Should she have accepted that first job offer, even though it was far below her qualifications and experience level? As she prepared for bed, Margaret's thoughts turned to the young soldiers she'd mentored throughout her career. Many of them were still serving, continuing the mission that she'd dedicated 15 years of her life to supporting. She wondered what they would think if they knew she was struggling to find civilian employers who respected their shared experience. Sergeant First Class Amanda Foster had served under Margaret's command during a particularly challenging deployment to Afghanistan. Foster was now a platoon sergeant herself, leading soldiers in the same traditions that had shaped Margaret's career. Would Foster eventually face the same dismissive attitudes when her time came to transition to civilian life? The thought of promising young leaders like Foster being treated with the same contempt Margaret had experienced at Blackwater and Paramount filled her with a renewed sense of purpose. Maybe her struggle wasn't just about finding a job. Maybe it was about proving that military experience had value, that the skills developed through service were assets rather than limitations. Thursday morning arrived with an unusual level of anxiety. Colonel Williams' cryptic message about keeping Thursday evening free had been nagging at Margaret's thoughts. She'd tried calling the colonel back several times, but all her calls had gone to voicemail. Whatever Williams wanted to discuss, it was apparently something that couldn't be shared over the phone. Margaret spent the day working on applications and reaching out to her network, but her heart wasn't really in it. The constant rejections and dismissive attitudes were taking their toll. She found herself wondering if she should just take any job that was offered, regardless of how it utilized her skills or compensated her fairly. At 3:47 p.m., her phone rang with an unknown number. "Major Chen? This is Lieutenant Colonel Bradley Hoffman from the Pentagon. I need you to report to the Secretary of Defense's office at 1,800 hours today. Dress uniform required." Margaret's heart skipped. "Sir, I believe there may be some confusion. I submitted my resignation 6 months ago. I'm no longer on active duty." "Major, your resignation has not been approved. You remain on active duty pending further review. Can you confirm your attendance at 1,800 hours?" "Yes, sir. I'll be there." Margaret hung up the phone with trembling hands. What could the Secretary of Defense possibly want with her? Had she done something wrong? Was there some issue with her resignation paperwork? The timing seemed too coincidental to ignore, especially given Colonel Williams' strange phone call. She spent the next 2 hours preparing her dress uniform, ensuring every detail met the exacting standards she'd maintained throughout her career. As she drove toward the Pentagon, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't possibly anticipate. The security checkpoint at the Pentagon felt both familiar and foreign after months of civilian job interviews. The guards recognized her credentials, but she felt like she was entering a world she'd already left behind. As she walked through the corridors toward the secretary's office, Margaret tried to prepare herself for whatever news awaited her. What she couldn't prepare for was the crowd of cameras, reporters, and senior military officials that would be waiting for her arrival. Margaret approached the Secretary of Defense's office with measured steps, her polished dress shoes echoing through the marble corridors of the Pentagon. The familiar weight of her service decorations felt heavier than usual, each ribbon and medal representing moments of her career that civilian employers had dismissed as irrelevant. She checked her watch. 1,755 hours. 5 minutes early, exactly as protocol demanded. The outer office buzzed with activity that seemed unusual for a Thursday evening. Staff members moved with purposeful urgency, carrying folders marked with security classifications Margaret recognized from her intelligence background. Lieutenant Colonel Hoffman, who had summoned her earlier, emerged from an inner office and approached with an expression she couldn't read. "Major Chen, thank you for coming promptly. Before we proceed, I need to verify your security clearance status and have you sign some documentation." Margaret accepted the tablet he offered, scrolling through forms that included non-disclosure agreements and media consent waivers. The presence of media-related paperwork struck her as odd for what she assumed would be a routine administrative meeting about her resignation. "Sir, may I ask what this is regarding?" Hoffman's expression softened slightly. "Major, I know this is unusual, but I need you to trust the process. The secretary will explain everything momentarily." As Margaret signed the digital forms, she noticed movement through the frosted glass doors leading to the main office. Silhouettes moved back and forth, and she could hear muffled voices discussing camera angles and lighting positions. Whatever this meeting was about, it was clearly being documented. "Major Chen?" A familiar voice called from behind her. Margaret turned to see General Patricia Martinez, the Army Chief of Staff, approaching with a smile that seemed to contain secrets. General Martinez had been a role model throughout Margaret's career, one of the highest-ranking women in the military, and a pioneer who had opened doors for officers like Margaret. "General Martinez, ma'am, I wasn't expecting to see you here. I wouldn't miss this for the world, Major. You've earned what's coming next." Before Margaret could ask for clarification, the inner office doors opened to reveal Secretary of Defense Robert Crawford. The secretary was a distinguished man in his early 60s, whose reputation for both military expertise and political acumen had made him one of the most respected defense leaders in recent history. "Major Chen, please come in. We have a great deal to discuss." Margaret entered the office to find herself facing an array of cameras, lighting equipment, and media personnel from major news networks. CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, and military-focused outlets had representatives present, their equipment focused on a podium bearing the Department of Defense seal. The setup was clearly for a significant announcement. But Margaret couldn't fathom why she would be involved. "Major, please have a seat," Secretary Crawford indicated a chair positioned to the side of the room where she would be visible to the cameras but not the primary focus. "What I'm about to tell you has been classified until this moment, and you're learning this information at the same time as the American public." Margaret's mind raced through possibilities. Had there been some security breach related to her clearance? Was there an issue with one of her former operations? The presence of cameras suggested something positive, but her recent experiences had trained her to expect disappointment. Secretary Crawford moved to the podium as camera operators made final adjustments to their equipment. Margaret noticed several senior Pentagon officials filing into the room, including generals whose faces she recognized from military publications and news briefings. The gravity of the situation began to dawn on her, though she still couldn't comprehend her role in whatever was about to unfold. "Ladies and gentlemen," Secretary Crawford began, addressing the assembled media, "thank you for joining us this evening for a special announcement regarding military promotions and recognition of exceptional service." Margaret's hands gripped the arms of her chair as the secretary continued. "Throughout our nation's history, we have been blessed with military leaders who exemplify the highest standards of courage, innovation, and dedication. Today, I have the honor of announcing promotions that recognize such exceptional service and prepare our military for the challenges of tomorrow." The secretary paused, allowing his words to resonate through the room. The first announcement concerns the promotion of Major Margaret Chen to the rank of Brigadier General, effective immediately. This promotion makes General Chen the youngest woman in United States Army history to achieve the rank of Brigadier General, and recognizes her extraordinary contributions to national security over the past 15 years. The words hit Margaret like a physical force. Brigadier General, the youngest woman in Army history. She felt her vision blur momentarily as the magnitude of the announcement registered. Around the room, cameras swiveled to capture her reaction, while reporters scribbled notes and whispered into their microphones. Secretary Crawford continued, seemingly unaware of Margaret's shock. "General Chen's promotion is based on her exceptional performance in multiple combat zones, her innovative approaches to counterterrorism strategy, and her leadership in developing training protocols that have enhanced the effectiveness of our special operations forces." Margaret tried to process what she was hearing. The secretary was describing classified operations she had led, innovations she had developed, and achievements that she couldn't even include on civilian job applications due to security restrictions. All the work that corporate executives had dismissed as following orders was being recognized at the highest levels of government. Additionally, the secretary continued, General Chen has been selected to lead the newly established Joint Task Force on Military-Civilian Integration, a critical initiative designed to improve cooperation between military and civilian sectors in addressing national security challenges. The irony was overwhelming. While civilian employers questioned whether she could adapt to their corporate cultures, the Pentagon was asking her to bridge the gap between military and civilian worlds at a strategic level. The position would require exactly the kind of innovative thinking and leadership flexibility that companies like Blackwater and Paramount had insisted she lacked. "General Chen," Secretary Crawford addressed her directly, "would you please join me at the podium?" Margaret rose from her chair, her legs unsteady as she approached the microphone. The assembled media focused their attention on her, cameras capturing every expression as she tried to comprehend this dramatic reversal of fortune. "General Chen, can you share your thoughts on this promotion and your new assignment?" Margaret looked out at the sea of reporters, many of whom she recognized from evening news broadcasts. Behind the cameras, she could see Pentagon officials who had shaped her career, colleagues who had served alongside her in dangerous places, and mentors who had believed in her potential even when she had doubted herself. "Mr. Secretary, I am deeply honored and frankly stunned by this recognition," Margaret began, her voice stronger than she felt. "Over the past several months, I've learned that there are significant misconceptions about the value of military service in civilian contexts. I hope that my new role will help bridge that understanding and demonstrate that the skills developed through military service Leadership, innovation, adaptability, and commitment to excellence are exactly what our nation needs to address complex challenges. The words flowed more naturally as Margaret found her footing. I've had the privilege of serving alongside extraordinary men and women who demonstrate creativity, courage, and problem-solving abilities under the most challenging circumstances imaginable. My goal will be to ensure that these capabilities are properly understood and utilized across all sectors of American society. Secretary Crawford nodded approvingly. General Chen, your new position will involve working directly with private sector organizations to enhance their understanding of military capabilities and improve integration between civilian and military personnel. Can you elaborate on your vision for this role? Margaret thought immediately of Morrison, Whitfield, and Hartwell at Blackwater Defense Solutions. In less than 72 hours, she had gone from being mocked by those executives to being promoted to a position where she would have the authority to educate their industry about the realities of military service. Mr. Secretary, I believe there's tremendous untapped potential in improving military-civilian cooperation. Many private sector organizations could benefit enormously from understanding how military leaders approach complex problems, manage diverse teams, and deliver results under pressure. Similarly, military operations can be enhanced by adopting innovative practices from civilian sectors. My role will be to facilitate these exchanges and break down the barriers that currently limit collaboration. A reporter from CNN raised her hand. General Chen, this promotion comes at a time when many veterans struggle to find employment in civilian sectors. Do you see this as an opportunity to address those challenges? The question struck directly at Margaret's recent experiences. Absolutely. One of my priorities will be working with private sector employers to help them understand the true value of military experience. Too often, veterans are seen as inflexible or limited in their thinking, when the reality is that military service develops exactly the kind of adaptable, innovative leadership that modern organizations need most. Another reporter followed up. General, what message do you have for veterans who are currently facing challenges in their transition to civilian careers? Margaret paused, thinking of all the conversations she'd had with former colleagues who had encountered similar dismissive attitudes from civilian employers. My message is that your service matters, your skills are valuable, and the right opportunities will recognize your worth. Don't let anyone convince you that military experience is a limitation. It's one of the most comprehensive leadership development programs in the world. Secretary Crawford stepped back to the microphone. I want to emphasize that General Chen's promotion represents the Department of Defense's commitment to recognizing and utilizing exceptional talent. Her new role reflects our understanding that the challenges facing our nation require innovative thinking and the ability to work across traditional boundaries. The Secretary gestured toward the assembled officials. General Chen will report directly to my office and will have the authority to establish partnerships with civilian organizations, develop new training protocols, and represent the Department of Defense in high-level discussions with private sector leaders. Margaret realized that her new position would likely bring her into contact with companies like Blackwater Defense Solutions, but now she would be approaching them as a Pentagon representative with the authority to influence their perspectives on military personnel. The thought of potentially encountering Morrison and his colleagues in her new capacity brought a smile to her face that she quickly suppressed. General Chen, another reporter called out, can you tell us about the timeline for implementing this new task force? I'll be establishing the task force structure over the next 30 days, Margaret replied, feeling more confident as she spoke. We'll begin with a comprehensive assessment of current military-civilian cooperation initiatives, identify areas for improvement, and develop strategic partnerships with key organizations across multiple industries. Secretary Crawford concluded the press conference with final remarks about the importance of recognizing military talent and ensuring that veterans received the respect and opportunities they deserved. As the cameras stopped rolling and reporters began filing their stories, Margaret found herself surrounded by congratulatory colleagues and Pentagon officials who had been instrumental in her promotion. General Martinez approached with a knowing smile. Margaret, I have to ask, how does it feel to go from job interviews to this in just 72 hours? Margaret laughed, finally allowing herself to process the dramatic shift in her circumstances. "General, I'm still trying to wrap my head around it all. 3 days ago, I was being told that military experience was irrelevant to modern business. Now I'm being asked to help integrate military and civilian sectors at the highest levels." "Well," General Martinez replied, "sometimes the best leaders are those who have been underestimated. Your experiences with civilian employers will actually make you more effective in this new role because you understand firsthand the misconceptions that need to be addressed." As Margaret left the Pentagon that evening, she couldn't help but think about the executives at Blackwater Defense Solutions. In just a few hours, they would likely see news coverage of her promotion on the same networks they probably watched during their morning coffee. The woman they had dismissed as too rigid and limited for their corporate culture was now a general with a mandate to transform how military and civilian organizations work together. The irony was perfect, but more importantly, Margaret finally understood that her value had never been in question. The right opportunity had simply been waiting for the right moment to present itself. Friday morning arrived with a deluge of congratulations that Margaret Chen, now Brigadier General Chen, had never experienced in her 15-year career. Her phone buzzed incessantly with messages from former colleagues, family members, and military personnel she'd served with across the globe. The story of her promotion had made front-page news in major newspapers and dominated military news websites. But it was the civilian news coverage that truly captured the magnitude of her new position. CNN had run a segment titled, "From Job Rejection to Pentagon Promotion, the General Who Broke Barriers." Fox News featured an analysis piece on military-civilian cooperation initiatives. Even business publications like Forbes and Harvard Business Review had picked up the story, focusing on the implications for corporate hiring practices regarding veterans. Margaret sat in her new office at the Pentagon, still adjusting to the reality of her surroundings. The office came with her new position as head of the Joint Task Force on Military-Civilian Integration, a spacious corner suite with windows overlooking the Potomac River. Her assistant, Major Kevin Walsh, had been fielding calls all morning from organizations requesting meetings, interviews, and consultations. "General, I have the CEO of TechCorp Holdings on line 3, Major Walsh announced through the intercom. He's requesting an urgent meeting about potential military contracting opportunities. Also, Meridian Financial Group's board chairman would like to schedule lunch to discuss veteran hiring initiatives." Margaret smiled wryly. Meridian Financial had sent her a rejection letter just 3 days earlier, citing her lack of relevant industry experience. Now they wanted to discuss veteran hiring over lunch. The transformation was remarkable, though not entirely surprising. "Schedule them for next week, Major. Right now, I need to prepare for this morning's video conference with defense contractors." The video conference was Margaret's first official act in her new role, and the participant list read like a who's who of military contracting companies. Blackwater Defense Solutions was among the organizations that had requested to join the discussion about new military-civilian integration protocols. At precisely 0900 hours, Margaret activated the secure video connection that linked her office with conference rooms across the country. Familiar corporate logos appeared on her screen as representatives from major defense contractors joined the call. In the bottom right corner of her display, she could see the Blackwater conference room, where 3 figures sat around a polished table. Even through the digital connection, she recognized them immediately: James Morrison, Sandra Whitfield, and David Hartwell, the same executives who had spent 45 minutes explaining why her military experience was irrelevant to modern business. "Good morning, everyone," Margaret began, her voice carrying the authority that came with her new rank and position. "I'm Brigadier General Margaret Chen, and I'll be leading the Department of Defense's new initiative to enhance cooperation between military and civilian organizations." She watched the Blackwater participants carefully as she spoke. Morrison's expression shifted from professional attention to something resembling confusion, then dawning recognition. Whitfield leaned forward, squinting at her screen as if trying to confirm what she was seeing. Hartwell's face went completely pale. "The purpose of today's conference is to establish new protocols for military-civilian integration, including enhanced standards for how defense contractors evaluate and utilize military personnel in their organizations." Margaret outlined the scope of her new authority, which included the power to influence contractor selection based on their veteran employment practices and military integration policies. She explained that the Department of Defense would be implementing new metrics for measuring how effectively contractors leveraged military experience and expertise. General Chen came a voice from one of the participating companies. Can you elaborate on how these new standards will affect existing contracts and future bidding processes? Certainly. Moving forward, the Department of Defense will consider veteran employment practices, military cultural competency, and integration effectiveness as significant factors in contractor evaluation. Organizations that demonstrate superior understanding and utilization of military talent will receive preferential consideration for new contracts and contract renewals. Margaret noticed increased activity in the Blackwater conference room. The three executives were engaged in what appeared to be an urgent whispered conversation, with Morrison gesturing animatedly while Whitfield frantically typed on her laptop. Additionally, Margaret continued, I'll be conducting on-site evaluations of major contractors to assess their current practices and provide recommendations for improvement. These evaluations will include interviews with veteran employees, analysis of hiring and promotion patterns, and assessment of organizational culture regarding military service. The implications were clear to everyone on the call. Margaret now had the authority to directly impact the business prospects of companies like Blackwater based on how they treated veterans. The woman they had dismissed as unqualified for their corporate culture could now influence their ability to secure lucrative government contracts. General, another participant asked, what timeline are we looking at for these evaluations? I'll begin scheduling site visits next week. Blackwater Defense Solutions will be among the first companies I evaluate, given their significant role in defense contracting. Margaret watched as Morrison's face went from pale to ashen. She could see him frantically writing notes while Whitfield appeared to be having some kind of urgent discussion with someone off camera. After the conference ended, Margaret spent the rest of the morning reviewing files on the companies she would be evaluating. Blackwater's veteran employment statistics made for interesting reading. Despite being a defense contractor that depended heavily on military contracts, the company employed remarkably few veterans in leadership positions. Their hiring practices showed a pattern of offering below-market compensation to veteran applicants and placing them in positions that didn't utilize their military experience effectively. At 1,300 hours, Major Walsh knocked on her office door. General, I have James Morrison from Blackwater Defense Solutions holding on line 1. He says it's urgent and concerns your upcoming evaluation. Margaret smiled. The speed of Morrison's response was impressive, if predictable. Put him through, Major. General Chen. Morrison's voice carried a tone she'd never heard during their previous encounter, a mixture of respect, nervousness, and barely concealed panic. Congratulations on your promotion. I wanted to personally welcome you to your new position and discuss how Blackwater can support your integration initiative. Thank you, Mr. Morrison. I appreciate your call. As I mentioned during this morning's conference, I'll be conducting a comprehensive evaluation of your organization's military integration practices. Yes, about that. I was hoping we could schedule a preliminary meeting to discuss our veteran programs and ensure we're aligned with your expectations. Margaret leaned back in her chair, savoring the moment. Mr. Morrison, I believe we've already met. You interviewed me for a position at your company earlier this week. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly 10 seconds. I'm sorry, General, I don't recall. Tuesday afternoon, your conference room. You, Ms. Whitfield, and Mr. Hartwell spent considerable time explaining why military experience wasn't relevant to your organization's needs. You suggested that military personnel lack creativity and innovation, and that we're only capable of following orders rather than thinking independently. Another long pause. When Morrison spoke again, his voice was noticeably strained. General, I think there may have been some misunderstanding during that interview. Blackwater has tremendous respect for military service, and we're always looking for ways to better integrate veteran talent into our organization. Interesting. During our meeting, you specifically stated that military leadership experience wasn't, quote, real leadership, and that my 15 years of service was essentially government work that had no relevance to your fast-paced corporate environment. General Chen, perhaps there was some miscommunication. I'd very much like the opportunity to clarify our position and discuss how we can improve our veteran integration programs. Margaret decided to demonstrate the kind of tactical decision-making that Morrison had claimed military personnel couldn't master. Mr. Morrison, I'll be conducting my evaluation of Blackwater next Friday at 09:00 hours. The assessment will include interviews with your current veteran employees, review of your hiring practices, and evaluation of your organizational culture regarding military service. I suggest you use the intervening time to prepare thoroughly. Of course, General, we'll be ready. And General Chen? I want to personally apologize if anything during our previous meeting gave you the impression that we don't value military experience. That certainly wasn't our intention. Mr. Morrison, I have a recording of our entire interview session as is standard practice for my job search documentation. I'll be reviewing that recording as part of my preparation for next week's evaluation. The statement wasn't entirely true. Margaret hadn't actually recorded the interview, but Morrison's sharp intake of breath suggested he believed her claim. The thought of his dismissive comments being played back during a Pentagon evaluation clearly terrified him. I understand, General. We'll be fully prepared for your visit. After ending the call, Margaret couldn't help but laugh. The transformation in Morrison's attitude was complete and immediate. The man who had mocked her service was now apologizing and scrambling to prove his company's respect for veterans. Her afternoon was filled with similar calls from other organizations that had previously rejected her applications. Paramount Industries called to, quote, clarify any misunderstandings about their veteran hiring practices. TechCore Industries requested an urgent meeting to discuss, quote, expanding opportunities for military talent. Even companies that hadn't interviewed her were calling to ensure they met the new integration standards. The most interesting call came from Gregory Peterson at Paramount Industries. Peterson, who had spent their interview explaining why military thinking was too structured for their innovative environment, now wanted to discuss how they could better leverage, quote, the unique problem-solving capabilities that military experience provides. Mr. Peterson, Margaret said during their conversation, just to clarify, when we met earlier this week, you specifically stated that military personnel tend to be very structured in their thinking and lack the creativity needed for your industry. Has your perspective on that changed? General Chen, I believe there may have been some miscommunication during our discussion. Paramount has always recognized the value of military experience, and we're committed to improving our integration of veteran talent. I see. So when you asked whether I had chosen military service due to financial necessity, or because I needed more structure in my life, that was meant to demonstrate your company's respect for military service. Another uncomfortable pause. General, I think we should focus on moving forward and ensuring that Paramount meets your new integration standards. By the end of the day, Margaret had scheduled evaluation visits with 8 major defense contractors, all of whom had suddenly discovered deep appreciation for military experience and urgent need to improve their veteran integration programs. The irony was almost too perfect. The same companies that had dismissed her military background were now competing to prove their respect for veterans. Major Walsh appeared in her doorway as she prepared to leave for the day. General, I have one more call for you. Colonel Williams is on line too. Margaret picked up the phone to hear her former commanding officer's familiar laughter. Margaret, I've been watching the news coverage of your promotion. I have to ask, how does it feel to go from rejected job candidate to Pentagon general in 72 hours? Patricia, it's surreal. This morning I had 8 different companies calling to apologize for miscommunications during my interviews and requesting urgent meetings to discuss their veteran programs. I'm not surprised. Your story has become a case study in corporate short-sightedness. Harvard Business School is already using your experience in their veteran integration curriculum. Margaret shook her head in amazement. 3 days ago, these same companies were telling me that military experience was a liability. Now they're desperate to prove they value veterans. Well, Margaret, sometimes the best way to change people's minds is to show them what they're missing. Your new position gives you the platform to ensure that other veterans don't face the same dismissive attitudes you encountered. As Margaret drove home that evening, she reflected on the dramatic transformation of her circumstances. The executives who had mocked her service were now scrambling to win her approval, The companies that had questioned her value were now competing for her endorsement. Most importantly, she now had the authority to ensure that other veterans would be evaluated based on their true capabilities, rather than civilian misconceptions about military service. The real victory wasn't personal vindication, it was the opportunity to change how an entire industry viewed and valued military experience. Starting next week, Margaret would begin the work of transforming military-civilian integration, one evaluation at a time. 3 months after her promotion, Brigadier General Margaret Chen stood in the lobby of Blackwater Defense Solutions, but this time she wasn't there as a job applicant. She wore her dress uniform with the single star of her new rank prominently displayed, accompanied by a team of Pentagon evaluators carrying tablets and assessment protocols. The same marble floors that had witnessed her humiliation now reflected the image of a woman who had returned with the power to reshape an entire industry's approach to veteran employment. The receptionist, a young woman named Ashley who had witnessed Margaret's original interview, struggled to maintain her professional composure. "General Chen, Mr. Morrison is waiting for you in the executive conference room. The entire leadership team is assembled for your evaluation." Margaret nodded graciously. "Thank you, Ashley. I remember you from my previous visit. How has your experience been working with the veteran employees here?" Ashley's eyes widened slightly. "Well, General, we actually don't have many veterans in our current workforce. Most of our leadership positions are filled by individuals with traditional business backgrounds." "I see. That's exactly the kind of information that will be valuable for our assessment." As Margaret and her evaluation team walked through the corridors toward the conference room, she noticed the dramatic changes that had taken place since her last visit. Posters celebrating military service adorned the walls, displaying messages about supporting our heroes and veteran excellence in corporate leadership. A glass display case near the executive offices showcased military memorabilia and featured profiles of the handful of veterans currently employed by the company. The transformation was impressive in its speed, if not its sincerity. Margaret understood that these changes were driven by fear, rather than genuine appreciation for military service, but they represented progress nonetheless. Other veterans applying for positions at Blackwater would at least encounter an environment that paid lip service to valuing their experience. The conference room doors opened to reveal a gathering that looked markedly different from her original interview. Morrison, Whitfield, and Hartwell were present, but they were joined by a dozen other executives, a newly hired director of veteran affairs, and what appeared to be a consultant specializing in military integration programs. "General Chen," Morrison rose from his seat with an enthusiasm that seemed almost desperate. "Welcome to Blackwater Defense Solutions. We're honored to have you here for this evaluation, and we're excited to show you the comprehensive veteran integration programs we've implemented." Margaret took her seat at the head of the conference table, her evaluation team flanking her on both sides. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present. She now occupied the position of authority in the same room where she had been dismissed and mocked. "Thank you, Mr. Morrison. I'm looking forward to a thorough assessment of your current practices and future initiatives." Morrison launched into a presentation that could only be described as desperate overcompensation. Blackwater had apparently developed a military excellence initiative that included preferential hiring for veterans, specialized onboarding programs designed to help military personnel transition to corporate culture, and fast-track promotion pathways for employees with military backgrounds. "We've also established partnerships with veteran service organizations," Whitfield added, her voice lacking the condescending tone Margaret remembered from their previous encounter. "Our goal is to become the premier destination for military talent transitioning to the private sector." Margaret listened patiently, taking notes on her tablet while her evaluation team asked detailed questions about implementation timelines, budget allocations, and measurable outcomes. The irony of the situation was profound. The same executives who had argued that military experience was irrelevant were now trying to convince her that they had always been champions of veteran employment. "Mr. Morrison," Margaret said during a pause in the presentation, "I'm curious about the timeline for these initiatives. When were these programs first conceived?" Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Well, General, we've been developing these concepts for some time, but the formal implementation began approximately 6 weeks ago." "I see. So these programs were developed after my promotion was announced?" The timing was coincidental, General. We had already identified veteran integration as a priority area for improvement. Margaret smiled diplomatically while making additional notes. The evaluation continued with interviews of current veteran employees, most of whom had been hired within the past month, in what appeared to be a frantic effort to improve the company's veteran employment statistics before her visit. The most revealing moment came during her individual interview with Marcus Thompson, a former Navy officer who had been hired as Blackwater's new Director of Veteran Affairs just 3 weeks earlier. Mr. Thompson, can you describe the organizational culture regarding military service before your arrival? Thompson glanced nervously toward the door before responding. General, to be completely honest, there seem to be significant misconceptions about the value of military experience. Several current employees have mentioned that veteran candidates were historically viewed as inflexible or too structured for the company's innovative culture. Have you encountered any specific examples of these attitudes? Yes, ma'am. I was told that during a recent interview, an executive allegedly said that military personnel only know how to follow orders and lack the creativity needed for corporate success. The same candidate was reportedly asked whether she had chosen military service due to financial necessity or because she needed structure in her life. Margaret maintained her expression, but internally she appreciated Thompson's diplomatic way of referencing her own experience without directly naming her. His willingness to acknowledge the company's previous attitudes suggested that real change might be possible, even if it had been motivated by external pressure rather than internal recognition. The evaluation concluded with Margaret's assessment of Blackwater's newly implemented programs. While the initiatives were comprehensive on paper, their recent development and obvious connection to her promotion made their sincerity questionable. However, the programs did establish frameworks that could benefit future veteran applicants, regardless of the motivation behind their creation. Mr. Morrison, Margaret said as the formal evaluation concluded, I want to address something directly. During my job interview here 3 months ago, you and your colleagues expressed very different views about the value of military experience. The room fell silent. Morrison's face flushed red while Whitfield stared at her hands, and Hartwell seemed to be studying the ceiling with intense concentration. You told me that military service was essentially government work with no relevance to your fast-paced corporate environment. You questioned whether I could think independently or adapt to civilian culture. You suggested that military leadership wasn't, quote, real leadership, because it involved following protocols rather than innovative thinking. Morrison opened his mouth as if to respond, then apparently thought better of it. I want you to understand, Margaret continued, that your attitudes weren't unique. I encountered similar misconceptions at multiple companies during my job search. The difference is that you now have the opportunity to demonstrate genuine change, rather than simply implementing programs designed to improve your evaluation scores. She stood, signaling the end of the meeting. My report will note the comprehensive nature of your new initiatives while also acknowledging their recent implementation. More importantly, I'll be conducting follow-up evaluations in 6 months to assess whether these programs represent genuine cultural change or merely surface-level compliance. As Margaret and her team prepared to leave, Morrison approached her privately. General Chen, I want to personally apologize for our previous meeting. You were clearly qualified for the position we were offering, and our assessment was based on misguided assumptions about military service. Margaret studied his face, looking for signs of genuine remorse versus calculated damage control. Mr. Morrison, I appreciate your apology, but understand that this isn't really about me. It's about the thousands of veterans who face similar dismissive attitudes when they transition to civilian careers. Your company now has the opportunity to lead by example in changing those perceptions. We're committed to doing exactly that, General. I hope so, because 6 months from now, I'll be back to see whether your commitment extends beyond the presence of Pentagon evaluators. As Margaret left Blackwater Defense Solutions for the second time, the experience felt completely different. She walked through the same lobby, past the same marble floors, but now she carried the satisfaction of knowing that her humiliating interview had ultimately led to systemic changes that would benefit other veterans. Over the following weeks, Margaret received reports from veterans who had applied to companies she had evaluated. The improvements were tangible, if sometimes superficial. Interview processes now included questions designed to understand rather than dismiss military experience. Hiring managers were receiving training on military to civilian skill translation. Most importantly, the conversation about veteran employment had shifted from skepticism to active recruitment. The broader impact of Margaret's story extended far beyond individual companies. Military transition programs began incorporating her experience as a case study in resilience and advocacy. Business schools developed curricula focused on properly evaluating military talent. Professional organizations created guidelines for interviewing veteran candidates. Margaret's favorite outcome was a letter she received from Sergeant First Class Amanda Foster, the young soldier she had mentored during her deployment to Afghanistan. Foster was approaching the end of her military service and had been dreading the transition to civilian employment. General Chen, Foster wrote, "Your story has completely changed my perspective on leaving the military. Instead of being afraid that civilian employers won't understand my experience, I now know that the right opportunities will recognize my value. You've shown all of us that our service matters, and that the skills we've developed are assets, not limitations." 6 months after her initial evaluation, Margaret returned to Blackwater Defense Solutions for her follow-up assessment. The changes were remarkable. The company had hired 37 veterans across various departments, with 12 in leadership positions. More importantly, conversations with long-term employees revealed genuine shifts in attitude toward military experience. Morrison, who had survived the corporate restructuring that followed Margaret's initial evaluation, seemed like a different person. During their final meeting, he made an observation that surprised her. "General, I've learned something important over the past 6 months. The veterans we've hired have brought perspectives and capabilities that we didn't even know we were missing. Your original assessment of our misconceptions was completely accurate." Margaret nodded. "Mr. Morrison, that's exactly the outcome I was hoping for. Not punishment for past attitudes, but recognition of the value that military experience brings to any organization." As Margaret drove away from Blackwater for the final time, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from humiliated job applicant to transformational military leader. The executives who had mocked her service had inadvertently created the conditions for industry-wide change in how veterans were perceived and valued. Her phone buzzed with a message from Colonel Williams. "Margaret, I just saw the quarterly veteran employment statistics. Companies in your evaluation program have increased veteran hiring by 340% since your promotion. You've accomplished something that formal policies and regulations couldn't achieve. You've changed hearts and minds." Margaret smiled as she typed her response. "Sometimes the best way to prove people wrong is to show them what they're missing. And sometimes getting mocked for your service leads to the opportunity to transform how everyone's service is valued." The story that had begun with humiliation and dismissal had ended with systemic change and newfound respect for military experience across an entire industry. Margaret Chen had proven that the value of military service wasn't diminished by civilian misunderstanding. It was simply waiting for the right moment to be fully recognized and appreciated. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.